Welcome, Wayfarers. I'm your host, Laura Alyn, and you're listening to ILA Radio, where we tune into all ways of knowing. Joining us today, we have Albert Bramante. Welcome, Albert.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here. I was looking forward to this.
Awesome. So, could you get started by sharing a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, I have a background in psychology as well as working with actors. So, for the past 21 years, I've been working representing actors as a talent agent for film, TV, theater, commercial, print, and voiceover. I've been kind of doing it all. And I also been a psychology professor, so I've been always interested in how the mind works and just curious about human behavior and all that. So it's something that's really exciting for me.
For sure, me too. So I was a psychology major. So I really wanted to understand like how we learn and how we can make it easier for people to learn because I think that in school it's you either learn this way or you're not gonna learn. So what was your schooling experience like?
Well, very interesting. I mean, I really didn't realize my full potential as a student until I was really in the latter part of my high school, studies. So when I was a junior in high school, I kind of woke up, so to speak, and then I was never a failure, but I was always like, I never had, any Fs, thank goodness for that. But I was always like a BC student, average. And I had a lot of teachers and even my family were always encouraging me, like, you can do better, you can do better. I guess I didn't believe it, at that point until it was like the tail part of the beginning of the middle of my junior year that I just woke up. So I went from a BC student to a straight A student, and simply because, and I started really enjoying it. It wasn't just like, oh, this is hard work. This is something I really enjoyed. So I became that student, that A student, and then I went to college, and pretty much I was always with honors and graduated with honors, and even with my master's and doctorate. So I was the thinker type. I was kind of like a nerd and bookworm type. I've always am. I still am. I still love to read. So even a lot of my college professors would classify me as a thinker, which I always was. Um, I wasn't into sports. I wasn't into athletics, like because I grew up in a blue collar family. I'm the youngest of five. My older brothers and my father were all into sports, athletics. My father was a football coach. My oldest brother was a football player and very good football coach. And it really, but I was different. I was not into sports at all. I love to read. They didn't. So it was kind of like I really didn't fit in, I think, in my family. I don't consider myself an outcast, but I wasn't exactly included into everything. Because again, everybody was athletics. I wasn't. So typically I was kind of an introvert as a child, where I had my own little world, but it wasn't, and I really didn't know how to make friends because I was, again, a little awkward. you know, I use that in quotes because now I wear it as a badge of honor, but I didn't really know how to fit in with kids my own age. So I was like the teacher's pet. I was the person who always hung out with the teachers, made friends with the teachers. I did everything possible. I wasn't picked on. I wasn't bullied. Not, thankfully, luckily. I did have a few kids that might have wanted to pick on me, um, but very few. As a matter of fact, I was fairly popular. I don't say I was the most popular, but I was fairly popular. And all throughout school, and then even in college, I was very well liked. But I was also the type that just I always was very laid back, even keeled, which I think aided to that, and I still am today. So, yeah, I consider myself an academic, and I've been a psychology professor too. So, I really consider myself like a bookworm. Although, coincidentally, I don't fit well with other academics. I've went to because I used to go to a lot of academic conferences. I used to go to psychology conferences, the APA, the American Psychological Association, and I never fit in. I never felt comfortable in these spaces. And even I've had a lot of students over the years tell me I'm not like every average college professor. So I tend to consider myself different. Although I love academics, I can hold myself my own in a great articulate discussion. I'm just not a typical academic.
Mhm. So it's so cool how your chart is lighting up. So I guess we'll start with Chiron because Chiron is
Okay.
the wounded warrior. And you have it in the fifth house, which is the house of expression. And it's interesting because Aries is related to sports and it's covering your fourth, which is the house of family, and the fifth, which is the house of expression. And it's that exactly what you were talking about, like feeling there's like a deep wound because you didn't like sports like the rest of your family. So Aries is a fire sign. So then we shoot up to Leo, and it's in the ninth house, which is deeper learning and going really deep into something. And it's also naturally what covers Sagittarius. And so it's that you found this structure within academia where you could kind of, well, you kind of said it, where you created like your own little world, and you're able to shine in that way. And it all points down to the last fire sign, which is Sagittarius, and you have it as
Hmm.
your rising sign as well as your sun sign and your Mars and your Neptune. So there's so much here in your first house. And it's interesting that you talked about getting along with teachers and getting and becoming like a philosopher, being a thinker type, because those are all traits of Sagittarius, and
Hmm.
they all show up here in the first house. You also talked about kind of feeling you said like weird is now like a badge of honor, and that's what
Hmm.
you were talking about with when you are as being a psychology professor, your students don't see you like everybody else. So it's not necessarily being weird. It's Aquarius is the sign of doing something different, and usually most times better. So that's really cool because you have it in the third house, and that's also where you have Venus. And with Venus, it's how to share your love. And so you share your love through your knowledge. So, looking at your PhD in psychology, what was your dissertation on?
So my dissertation was on self-defeating behavior in performing arts. The reason why that got into it is because when I started my PhD studies, I just started my first um, agency in a sense, and the one thing I noticed was there were a lot of actors that were self-sabotaging. And what I mean by self-sabotaging or self-defeating behavior was that they were not showing up for auditions, coming up with excuses for auditions, and a whole host of other things that were coming up all the time. You know, excuses, justifications. You know, and so what was I know? I think the biggest issue with that I was noticing was there was a major disconnect from what the actors were saying, like, "Oh, I want to work, I want to work, I want to work," and yet their actions were telling me another story. So I wanted to know what was going on, and I remember, beating my head against the wall, saying, "I don't understand, I don't understand." And then when it came time to start brainstorming ideas for a dissertation, we were advised to pick a problem that we wanted to solve, or some burning question to start with. And my question is, what's up with these actors? Why is this? What's psychologically happening here? So I turned my dissertation became self-defeating behavior in performing artists, and that's what I focused on my dissertation. And it was great because I was able to kind of bridge both of my love, psychology, and actors, and show business. So it was a way to kind of like go for full circle for me. Um, and I always, I guess going to my thinker days, I was a nerd. I loved research papers. I know very rarely we hear somebody say that, but I think it was for me just I have a love of knowledge, so I think it was just looking for knowledge, and I was very comprehensive when I did my research. And this is what I got a lot of praise from professors and teachers in my um, academic career, was how thorough I was when it came to research. And even my book that I published in 2024, there's if you look at my reference section, it is large and robust, because that's how I kind of treat things. I always look at, if I'm going to be a deep thinker, I feel like, deeply research is the way to go. And that was, I guess, going into what you were saying earlier about the philosopher in me. That's probably where that's rooted. So, yeah, I mean, now doing a dissertation, as having said that I like research papers, the dissertation is a completely different beast, and it's a little different than a term paper. A lot different. Something that it's like it was one of those things where I did it once, I don't ever want to do it again. Because I know some of my colleagues, they'll like I not many, but a few will have like 2 or 3 PhDs. I'm only doing one.
I think you only need one.
Yeah, I'm done. I'm done. But
Yeah.
now, having said that, I'm done with formal education. I That doesn't mean I'm done with learning, and I want to make that big distinction. I might have what they call a terminal degree, but my education is anything but terminal. My learning is anything but. So, as a matter of fact, I might even look at you could even look at that. That's just the beginning. So I always have a learning mentality. I'm always wanting to learn. I'm reading. I read books. I like to learn new things. So that's something that again probably ties into the philosopher side of things. I just have a love of knowledge. So the weird thing was one badge of honor. Another badge of honor that I used to get yelled. Well, two other badges of honors I used to get yelled at as a kid. One for being nosy, and two for being a daydreamer. So I got lectured about that a lot as a child, both from teachers and from my family. Stop being nosy, stop daydreaming, stop zoning out. I can't help it. Now I feel like that's a superpower, and I think that for me, I reframe nosy as just being curious.
Yeah, definitely. I think that that's how we learn is by being curious and by being open to all of
Right.
our senses and observations. And that brings me to our first way of knowing, which is empirical knowing. So, being a researcher, I'm sure you had to get a lot of evidence and empirical knowledge to be able to write your papers. So, could you give us any tips on how to be an efficient researcher, or like how to get so much data and bring it together?
Well, I would say definitely, do thorough research. I mean, I again, at the college university libraries, I've always used deep databases, and I've always was a deep thinker. The one thing I would always say is, like, when you're picking a topic to research or picking a topic to know, what's good to know is even alternative viewpoints that might even be counter indicative of what you're trying to demonstrate or to defend. Because I think it's important to understand, to think critically. So that means looking at viewpoints and literature that goes completely against what you're trying to demonstrate. Because I feel like if I'm going to be an effective researcher or effective thinker, I need to consider all viewpoints. And I'm not saying that you always have to switch your viewpoints, but it's a good idea to get different perspectives on it, not just one perspective. And it's a good idea to get idea from different sources. You know, the nerd in me used a lot of psychological journals, peer reviewed journals, but also look at like blogs and videos and lectures from different people. TED talks are great. Podcasts are excellent. Consider all those as points of data. So I was, like I said, very thorough in my research. sometimes a little too thorough to a point where I think I might at some points create extra work for myself. But you would sometimes see like thumb drives, or at that time disk drives. I'm aging myself a bit, but I would have full drives of papers because I would go from like 10, 12 years back and just go all the way forward and say, okay, what are the articles in this year and that year and this year? And then I would just, do a dump and then start reading them and say, okay, what can I borrow from this? What can I borrow from that? And so I would sit when I would organize my papers. The first thing I would do is just I'd read an article and and summarize it in my own words. So it would be all out of order. It would be completely. I didn't have any coherence in the beginning. I was just summarizing the article as I was reading them. And then after that, I took all my summaries and then started putting them in a coherent order. Before I would start that, after I did all my summaries, I then put an outline together of what I wanted to write about, and then I would start looking at my summaries and like, hey, which sections go here, and then I would just pull it in there, and then I would put my own thoughts and an intro, conclusion, and slap the thing and call it a paper. So
Mhm.
I think that's why I was able to be so prolific. Sometimes I could actually write a 25 to 30 page paper in a weekend because it's just because by the time I was in for my PhD studies, I had a very good system rolled in there. And most of the PhD research papers are 25, 30 pages, minimum. So it was very easy for me to do that. Like there were times where I pulled it off in a weekend, where I had because I think it was just the way I dumped the information and then, you know, put it together. Some people
Mhm.
just sit there, I think, from page one and just start writing. I didn't do that. I just, the writing was like the last part, of it after the extracting the data, putting the outline, and then putting the paper together.
Mhm. Yeah. So I'm really curious of how we can spread knowledge because I think that like writing like the newest things in like a research journal kind of framework is really hard for general audiences to pick up just like a random
Hmm.
psychology journal
Right.
article. So, do you have any suggestions or how do you see it changing in the future on how
Well,
to get more knowledge out there?
I think this is where I come and maybe a bit of a I may be in the minority here, but I do feel like AI can help with that now.
Hmm.
Because ChatGPT, Claude, or even there's a premium service called Chat PDF where you can upload these PDFs of the journal articles that may be dense, a little bit dense, and then say, okay, summarize this in everyday, an everyday way, and then you can kind of then digest it as a general audience member. So that's the one thing I would say because I could identify this because I had a lot of friends and family that were trying to be very supportive when I got my dissertation. They're like, "Oh, send it to me. I want to read it." And I know they had good intentions of wanting to read it, but most of them got to like page 2 or 3 and were like, "I'm done," because it was written very dense and academic, in a purely academic sense. So, but I would say definitely the biggest thing is like AI or just even summarizing it and um, having more even of people that are writing it, like, maybe writing it more of a everyday too long didn't read like the LDR thing format. Um, Now, one tip that I've learned that helped me even with learning is when you're trying to digest something or read something to learn, act as if you're about to teach it to somebody else. Because then you start to read it in a more effective way and digest the information in a more effective way. So, like, I would say pretend like, you're going to teach this to your friend after reading it. So now you're going to read it in a totally different light. But I think the main thing is just kind of making it more accessible is the key. And that's
Yeah.
sort of why I wrote the book, Rise Above the Script, because the foundation was on my dissertation, but only maybe 2 or 3 or 5% of the population are going to be able to understand and appreciate the dissertation. The other 90%, it's not a bad. I'm not knocking my work, but it's just the way it is.
Yeah.
Um, unless I make it in an accessible format.
Yeah. Do you think that it's our job as academics to make the work more accessible? Because I constantly find myself like wanting to write in the academic fashion because it is an academic paper, but then also still having my natural voice in it so that it's a little less academic, a little less jargony, so that more people can read it, can understand it. But then
Yeah,
I don't want it to take away from the institution of having this high level rigor to it too.
yeah.
So how do you
I,
balance that?
I'm. Well, the important thing is obviously if you're submitting a paper for a grade, you will have to follow the institution and the professor and the guidelines. But then you could create two versions even. Like okay, here is the everyday sense where you just kind of like take the gist of the research. Because the one thing, and this is not a knock, because again, I appreciate, I love academia, but I feel a lot of times these heavy, dense journal articles are really, if you really condense it, you can probably summarize it in 1 or 2 paragraphs in an everyday sense. This was done. This is what we found, and then you can expand on your own words. Um, and I find myself, the biggest challenge was not so much when you've written so many papers and done so many things in an academic voice. The habit now is not to stay in that voice because even when I was writing my book, earlier drafts, I had some readers that were like, "I feel like I'm reading a doctoral dissertation," and I went, "Okay." And it had to be where I had to separate. Be like, okay, because it's so ingrained in me to kind of like write this way. It's just
Hmm.
it's my a second nature. So what I would say is really look at the most fundamental and elementary way to describe it and just do it. And then like I said, create two versions. Even if you one for a paper for school that outlines and satisfies all the needs for the rigor and the academic integrity and all that. But then at the same time, if you feel it's an important topic, then just create a separate version that you can dispel to
Yeah.
everybody.
Yeah. Could you tell us more about your book? Did you write it in the academic style or in
Yeah,
the
I
average?
did. What traditionally, because I said it was forced as habit, um, initially in the beginning, it still is considered a academic book, but I created what I had to do, um, and this is what my editor suggested to do several, instances in the book. I had to throw in examples and practical tips because otherwise, I think if I just did it without supervision, in a sense, from an editor, it probably would have read as a pure dissertation, and it would have lost, the appeal. So
Mhm.
and the one thing I said, well, if I'm gonna be putting examples and tips in there, I don't want to lose the fact of the research side of things. That's why you'll see a reference list. Now, I did the reference list for my own sake because honestly, most readers are not going to really care about a reference list of a book. I mean,
I do. I
some
always go
do.
to the back and see where they got the information.
Well, me too. I mean, me too, because I will always look at the footnotes and the citations and all that.
Hmm.
But I'd say the average reader, because if you're not an academic, the
Yeah.
average reader is not going to really care. But it's important for me to respect and cite. I'm not. I think it's so important to
Hmm.
respect it and always use citations.
Yeah.
That's something that is will never leave. But I think that now for my book again, what for my dissertation, I actually did real data. I didn't just I did an actual study. I I took about it was about 130 actors, and I gave them a couple different surveys, and instruments to use, and then had statistical analysis. Now, of course, I didn't include any of that statistics in my book because, again, unless you're a statistician, that's going to read like stereo instructions,
Yep.
and nobody's going to care. It's going to go right over their head, their head. So it was just usually again the average reader. If you're going to read a journal article or dissertation, okay, what did you maybe background information is great, but then what did you find? And sum it up in a quick way. What exactly? And so that would be a great way to kind of like if you're because in my classes I introduce research studies, but I'm not going to sit there and go and then they did this as a methodology because half of the students would I'd lose them and they'd fall asleep. So usually I say this is what they did in the study and this is what they found and let's move on. And so that I think is kind of putting it's like kind of looking at the cliff notes of something in a sense.
Mhm.
Extracting only the most important information and that's it.
Yeah. Yeah, so I feel like with the empirical knowledge, it's about like what can we actually grasp and like sense, see, hear, and what's actually going to stick inside, or what's just going to like go in through one ear and out the other. And I
Right.
think that's the things that are actually gonna stick. So our next way of knowing is developmental. So could you talk about your development into your career? Like, what was your career path like? How did you get into becoming a talent manager or talent agent? Was it?
hmm Yeah. Well, it's a very interesting journey because I had no intentions. I think if you told me, well, I'll get to it in a bit, but um, I was always, like I said, the thinker. So I never liked sports growing up. So and again, I really didn't identify with kids my own age. So I spent a lot of Saturdays in the library. Like outside of school, I was in the library. I read a lot of books, and I became just so interested in the brain, behavior, and I also had an interest in science on some rudimentary level. Like my favorite subject in high school was chemistry, and all of my peers and even family members that were in high school before me dreaded chemistry, and I remember I was scared to take it. It was my senior year, and I had to take it to go for college prep. There was no way around it, and I remember walking in very nervous the first day, and it turned out to be my absolute favorite subject of all time in high school. I just loved it. I was like, glue. I looked forward to going to class every time, and I had straight A's in chemistry. And that I think again might have been the philosophical side of me that kind of even gravitated towards that. Um, but I didn't like what was ironic, and this is where I kind of like wish if I could do things over again. I wasn't a very good in math, which is kind of an oxymoron because even I had my teachers scratching their heads saying, "Well, you're not good in math, but yet you're exceptional in chemistry. Explain this to me." And even in college, I took statistics and I aced statistics, but I struggled in algebra geometry, which again didn't make logical sense. Because I remember my statistics professor at the end of the semester was like, "You must have been a whiz in algebra geometry." I'm like, "No, I struggled. I barely passed." And they're like, "But in order to do statistics, you have to have an understanding of algebra and geometry," which led me to my next lifelong focus, and that became fear. How fear holds things. So one thing I kind of challenge going back to studies, and this is just is math. When people say I don't do well in math, I don't think that's true. I think it's fear
I was
and
just gonna say
resistance.
that because on your
It's
chart, it's what it says.
fear and resistance because I think now if I were to go back, that would be the one thing like we last said. If you go back in your high school career, I'd say the number one thing would be to walk into algebra one with an open mind. Because I probably feel like now, knowing what I know now, I would have crushed it in algebra and geometry. Because if I can do statistics or I can do, the abstract thinking and all that, and chemistry very well, I should have been easily able to do algebra and geometry. Plus, I'm
For
just very good in conventional math, not the. So it didn't really make sense as to now looking back why I struggled in algebra and geometry. The only thing I could do is fear and my own
yes.
block,
So let
and
me
that's
just interrupt us to bring this up with the astrology is that you have Lilith in Taurus, and Taurus is a sign of math, and Lilith is kind of like a bubble where like you're afraid to be too good at something because then you're going to be seen, and it's this whole like internal turmoil. Whereas with Scorpio, which is the sign of chemistry, it's where your heart is, it's where your north node is. So it's like you were always like being pushed into this direction of going really deep into chemistry, and you're good at math, but it's like there was this bubble that you needed to pop, and it sounds like now you've popped it. So
yeah, and because I'm very good at like addition, subtraction. I was always good in that, and that's what somebody said. Well, then you should have been naturally good in algebra and geometry. That should have been not an issue, but it was. So um, I that kind of stood me at a med school. I always wanted to be a doctor.
mhm.
Initially, I remember I told when I was in middle school, I had a conversation with my grandmother. It's like I'm going to be a doctor. I'm going to be a surgeon. I'm going to be all this. But in order to go to med school, you have to be taking all these advanced math classes. You know, and that kind of stood me away from that. But I said, the next best thing was I was going to have a PhD. So now, when I was going for my when I was in school for my bachelor's and master's, I had a strict orientation that I'm just going to be a clinical psychologist. I'm going to have a PhD. I'm going to have a practice. I'm going to teach full time, and that was it. I had no interest in show business, no interest in anything else. When I was in grad school, I went. I was dating, a girl at the time, and she's like, one day we were just driving around and we saw a fortune teller. It's like, come on, let's go. I was like, all right. I still wasn't really interested in this at this point. Always curious, but never really consciously interested because I was trying to put up front to that I don't believe in this stuff. I'm a scientist. But I always had an interest in like mediumship and all that. But anyway, that's a whole nother.
Uh,
So I go to the psychic, and I'm just thinking like she's totally off. She's totally off. She's totally off. Because one of the questions I asked her, I said, where do you see me in 20 years?" And she looks back and she said to me, which I thought was at the time absolutely ridiculous. She's like, "You're going to work in entertainment." And I walked out of there going like, "This woman, I must want my money back. This is like fully, BS and all that. I'm a psychologist. I'm a researcher. I'm not in entertainment. I'm not going to be in show business." And I dismissed it. When 2001, I happened to land an internship at a talk show because I used to. I'm not going to. I had a lot of downtime, so I used to watch talk shows when they were back in the heyday. Maury, Sally Just Raphael Montel. I watched all of that. So I went on Sally Just Raphael's website, and when she was very popular, and this was like in the late '90s, so this was in early 2000s. Her show got canceled, but I went on her website and I found contact us page. I was like, dear so and so, I watched your show. I'm a going to be a psychologist. I'm in a master's degree program on concentrating in marriage and family therapy. I'd love to get involved in your show. Come on, okay. And I even I was like, this no one's going to respond to me. So I clicked send. It was a submission on the website. I didn't hear anything. Okay, yeah, okay, this is not going to happen. I'm on my way to class one day, and I just happened to check my email, and I saw a thing response to your website, website comment. I didn't even realize that. I was like, All right, let me open it up. And it was the show. And they said, thank you for your message. Where are you located? Are you in the New York area? Which I was. We're looking for an intern for the spring. Naturally, I was like, yes. So that happened to work out where I worked in the counseling and crisis intervention. But that was my first foray into show business.
Do you think that it was intuition that led you to write
I
to go
think
with
so
it, or what?
because it was one like I now believe intuition is so powerful. And again, maybe it's maybe why I kind of separate myself from most of my peers in academia because I believe in that now. I believe in intuition. So it was just randomly, it was stroke of knowledge. I was on the website, so coincidentally say that because that snowballed everything now to where I'm at now. Because after the show, after my semester was over, it was kind of like the show was on its way out. So I didn't, obviously do any more work after the internship there. However, the people that I did the internship with were doing other things on the ground because it's the same year 9/11 happened. So they were like, we need help on the ground. We know you're into therapy. Can you help us lend a hand? So I started doing that, and a lot of the people I was started to work with because I did both volunteer and actually social services around 9/11 work were actors, directors, filmmakers that were giving back their time, and there were actually a lot of actors and filmmakers that were also social workers. So I started combining services there, and became very interested in acting again. I was in the drama coming out of high school. Still didn't put what the psychic said together yet because it wasn't until um, years later that I made the connection and my hair stood up on my arms and neck. So I went back, started being an actor a little bit, but I was too much interested in teaching and all that. I didn't have the drive to really be an actor. But the one thing I did notice when I said I don't fit in with academia, I fit in well with show business types. I fit in well with creatives. I'm like, these are my people. Like, I just felt so at home. And I didn't want to leave. When I would like, I was like, I really like being around these people. But I didn't, it was like, what do I do? I don't want to be an actor, but at the same time, I want to be around actors. So I started volunteering at film festivals in New York and doing all this great, other stuff. And then slowly but surely, I did some casting. I did some, just acting advocacy and support group. I created a support group for actors. And that was like the next step. Let me represent them and let me try to find them work. So 2004, I started my first company. A couple of years later, I was looking through old photographs and I saw the person who I was dating at the time. And that's when my hair stood up on my arm. Because now I was a full time agent representing actors, so I was working in show business, like she had predicted. Um,
So do
so
you really quick a really quick question? Would you say that that is a way of knowing that it's like she was able to like access this like spiritual realm to be able to give you this knowledge, or like how do you see that as like a valid way of knowing?
I do believe in that. I do believe again in the spiritual side of things. So I do believe that intuition is a way of knowing. So yeah. So that's sort of like where I believe that in a sense. So I do believe that it's a way of knowing. Maybe not directly or consciously knowing stuff. Because the one thing that I always had was told to me, I would go to, then I started being very interested in this in general. Again, don't tell my academic peers this, but I would go to, a lot of sometimes intuitive nights or, reading circles. And a lot of people would tell me the message that I would get consistently over and over again that I was very intuitive. and that I've very had almost a psychic ability.
Mhm.
And I do believe that, but I don't believe it's conscious. I don't believe it's like a conscious ability. But because one thing about me is sometimes reach out to people like, "Hey, I'm just thinking about you," and it happened to be the moment that they needed to hear somebody who knows. Or I would say a remark randomly, and somebody would say, "I needed to hear that at the moment."
Mhm.
So that was sort of like, as I do believe that that's a way of knowing, maybe not consciously, but it's still a way of knowing things.
Yeah. It shows up on your chart with Scorpio. So you have it half in your 11th and half in the 12th. So the 12th is the space that you were talking about where it's unconscious, where you can't really understand like why it's there, how it's happening, but it is there. Whereas the 11th house is community. So exactly what you're talking about, like being able to be so in tune with your community that when something's going on with them, something lights up inside of you, and it's that moon and that north node in Scorpio. Scorpio is the sign of going really deep into something and having a lot of power behind it. So like you do have these powers that are trying to find their way into your conscious living.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that is a lot of that going on.
Mhm.
So now, it's interesting that you know keep mentioning Scorpio because one I did get one thing done a chart read online, and like they said I had a lot of Scorpio energy, or like coordinates in there. The one thing I will really say, um, growing up, in a sense, I was always drawn to Scorpios
Yeah.
energetically.
Yeah,
Um,
that moon sign will just attract you to all of them. The moon sign is like the heart, the emotions, the inner
yeah,
world.
I,
Yeah.
both, in a dating sense, I've been always attracted to like Scorpio energy, and even non dating, like some of my favorite teachers in school were Scorpios.
I think you just crave that deepness. And I think that's why with academics, like I think that, oh, actually brings me to my next way of knowing it's rational. So I feel like with academia, we're trained to only look at reason
Right.
and only look at the rational, nothing else exists. And so it's very close minded in that sense. Whereas we academics, we do go deep, but it's only within reason. So like there's these other ways of knowing that I'm trying to open up. Whereas with artists and creatives and people in show business, they are more open to going deep. And I think that to be a good actor, you need to have Scorpio energy. And we all have Scorpio. So you just happen to have
Yeah.
a stellium. So it's like concentrated Scorpio energy.
Yeah.
But wherever anybody that's listening, wherever you have Scorpio, that's where you do need to go deep in order to see your physical dreams come into fruition, like to have them become a reality.
Yes. 100%. And that's always I've always been deep. Um, Sometimes a little too deep at times. Not for my sake. I think for other people's sake.
Hmm.
Like I like having those deep conversations, like deep thoughts. That is like my favorite place to be at. Um, I was always attracted to very deep topics. So, and this you may see this in my chart too. Particular deep thoughts about mortality and meaning of life, and so in high school, in college, well, one of my absolute favorite classes was death in perspective.
That's interesting.
Um, it was a very popular class. Believe it or not. But it was my favorite. I teach occasionally, and even this fall semester, I'm teaching the class on psychology of death and dying.
Mm.
So, which is, I love it, and yeah, it's intimidating for a lot of people, um, But I was always drawn to these deep meaning of life discussions, even as a child.
Mhm. So do you think that everything happens for a reason where like all these different like little like an invisible string pulling you through this life into how what you have now, or like do you think that like every decision that you like you have a crossroad that you come to every time and you have to make a decision? How do you think that that works, like leading to we're all getting led to our death,
Yeah,
so
I mean
in
that's going to happen. But I don't know if it's entirely a linear path in my belief. Like everything happens for a reason. Well, then why am I going to even try to do anything and to try things? I think that there's multiple pathways that we can take,
yeah.
and that will eventually work itself out in a reason too. But I also think we do have some control over our lives and our destinies. Um, I mean, ultimately, we are going to end up in one place. I mean, that's the way it is. I think, although how that happens and how our lives transform is also what we make of it too.
Hmm. So we were talking about the developmental way of knowing. I think that it teaches us to bloom like a flower, where we do have we're a bud, we bloom, and then we do end up dying. And so now the next way of knowing is rational. So how do you bridge everything to have it be in this like rational way of knowing where like logic still um I don't say is the leader, because I think that there are these other ways of knowing that we need to take into account, but how do
Well,
you
I
yeah.
think by staying grounded, staying listen, always looking at primary sources, not ignoring it or not negating that, but always just going with my gut. Like even when I'm researching something new about a new therapy approach or new treatment approach or anybody, I like to do my research. I don't want to just go by hype, and say, "Oh, this is the greatest thing ever." But I'm also starting to see, I think, in the past 10 years or so, much more research confirming the spiritual, intuitive side of things.
Mhm.
Um, there's a lot of medical and scientific experts that are now coming out and saying that there's proof of life after death,
Mm.
and that that this is not the end. Even though when we die, that it's not the end. As a matter of fact, there was a recent podcast episode where an actual physicist came out and said there's actual proof that life exists outside, after we pass, that death is not the end, that death is not the end.
Through
So,
NDEs, or how do they
well,
know?
the NDEs, I mean, that's a big thing, because even when it was in college, 20 some years ago with NDEs, there was always that alternative explanation. Well, your brain is, neurochemistry is there, which is true, obviously, because if you're able to kind of be revived, I think that you haven't completely died. You might have lost, the breathing functions and the heart rate. But they also did studies where were in a hospital setting, a couple of doctors who would have these near death, or these people who would code and come back. What they started doing was writing words that were not that you couldn't see, like on top of the ceiling or above a bed that you couldn't see with your conscious eye. To see, well, if people are really saying that they're on the ceiling looking down, they'd be able to read what was written on the ceiling.
Mhm.
And there was, I forgot the results, but there were some mixed results where some people were able to recall, which you couldn't almost possibly do in a rational sense if you were not on the ceiling. So it's
Mhm.
interesting to see that, sort of work on NDAs. But I think this physicist was kind of saying more from a the signs of how people, might communicate. Now, again, that's still subjective. And unfortunately, we don't really have direct empirical evidence yet where somebody, has come back and say, hey, I've been dead for a year or two, and here's what's going on.
Mhm.
Most of it is from NDEs, but and you can argue that it is an actual experience, but other people can say that it was just the neurochemical reaction of like the body losing oxygen because they
Well,
say you're
they
going through the chin. I think it's both. I do think it's both. Um, because also sometimes with NDEs, people were able to recall things that they would not have possibly been able to know.
exactly.
Like there was a couple times that NDEs were saying, that they met somebody on the other side, and then they
Mhm.
found out that this person did die, who they say they met, and they didn't know, like beforehand that this happened. So I do wonder, like I said, I've always had that question inside of me. I do wonder. So, and I've always did. Um, when I was 7, I went to my first funeral, and naturally, my everybody was trying to like tell my parents like, hey, be gentle, walking me up to a dead body, in a sense of the casket. And I remember walking up. I don't remember this. I'm just being told this, but I walked up to the casket. I looked at the body, who was my second cousin by it's removed, and I turned to my parents and I said, "Is this heaven?" And the people that were like his immediate family, his widow and his daughter, heard that and they lost it. Like they were touched by it, like moved. And so
Mhm.
that's where I kind of think my intuition stuck in. Because why would I? Why would a 7-year old ask that? Turn around and say, "Is this heaven?"
So the last way of knowing is reflective or like metacognitive, and to like really think about your experiences, open up your awareness. And I think that saying that as a 7-year old, it's not using that reflective way of knowing, it's using something that's deep within. So I think that that would be like more of an emotional way of knowing. Or what do you think, what way of knowing do you think that came up with?
I think it's a combination of both. Emotional and logic. I can't deny emotions from my own experience. I can't say that. Now, having also said that, I also think that um, we need to be able to manage our emotions a little bit sometimes too, because sometimes if we get like upset, angry, and that way we can sometimes get a little too reactive and not think rationally. I mean, think of teenagers sometimes how who sometimes just think way emotionally without considering the ramifications. Or how many times have you noticed someone who get really angry and lash out, and then 5 or 10 minutes later regret what they did or said? So I do think there has to be balance of both. I think there has to be a balance of rational and emotion when making decisions. Because I think purely one over the other is going to be disadvantageous. So if you're thinking just purely on a rational basis, you're not going to be able to connect with people. But at the same time, you could also do some, border on recklessness if you just go on emotions alone.
Yeah. Interesting, because Aquarius, so now we're doing a full circle now. Aquarius is also known as the water bearer.
Mm-hmm.
And through my research, I have linked Aquarius with imagination.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like exactly what you're talking about. Like it's this imagination is this like container for our emotions so that they don't get out of hand, but that they're still listened to and heard and understood. Because I think at the end of the day, an emotion just needs to be understood. It's kind of like a messenger where once the message is received, it can go away. But if it's
Right.
repressed, pushed away, then that's when it just starts getting even bigger and creating more
Right.
chaos.
Well, and that's why, like, even coming from a just strictly therapeutic counseling standpoint, emotions have to be dealt with. We cannot bury them. We cannot. It's like the pot of boiling water. If you put a lid on it over and over again, it's gonna eventually explode, and you're gonna have a disaster in your hands. The same thing go with emotions, and particularly and especially men need to take heed of this too, because I think it's becoming a little bit more uh, acceptable now. But when I was growing up in Gen X kind of standpoint, it was men were taught to be stoic and to be tough and to not cry or to, not show emotions. However, the emotions are still going to be there, and
Yeah,
we could try to bury it all we want. So the more that we try to bury it, the more problems we're going to have. And I even use this as a teaching example too, going back to like the topics. I'm not concerned about someone who's very emotional during a tragedy or something like that. The person who's crying, the person who's like a wreck. I'm concerned about the person who has it together, who seems to have it too much together.
mm,
The person who's like, it's no big deal. Those are the people I'm more concerned about, because I feel like that's a numb denial thing, and eventually it's gonna explode and they're gonna snap at some point.
for sure. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank
And
you for
we
having me.
always, yeah, and we always end with asking some last words as a polymath. So, you being a polymath by connecting these two different, unseemingly uh, industries and bringing them together is incredible. And so, thank you so much for doing that. For part of the collective with polymathy, it was before everybody was so specialized, and now we're really bridging these gaps. And so, just thank you so much for your work.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, where can people find you?
So you can find me on my website, albertbramante.com. You can also find me on socials. I'm on Instagram as at Dr. Albert Bramante and LinkedIn as Albert Bramante. So feel free to reach out, connect, we'll jump on a call, and want to work together. I'd be happy to.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And that's it. Thank you again to our guest for tuning into All the Ways of Knowing with us today. If today's conversation sparked something in you and you want to learn more about yourself, your astrology, and the ways that you know, consider booking a session with me at theornellian.com/book a session. And while you're there, you can go deeper into the Ornellian framework to learn more about the 16 various ways of knowing at theornellian.com/framework. And if you want to learn more about both me and our guest, our work, our worlds, and the threads behind this episode, everything is waiting for you in the show notes below. Until next time, keep listening to your soul, mind, body, and spirit. Bye, everybody.